Welcome to the Nomiki Show. I am Nomiki Konst. On today's show, we have congressional candidate Samelys López. She's endorsed by Matriarch. She is endorsed by AOC, and she is trying to win the nomination during COVID in a very crowded primary. It is a must-see interview. We also have the one and only Nichols, who's here to talk about his new book, which gives us a little bit of history to reflect on, 75 years of Democratic Party politics and how the movement has been crushed, what we can learn in this era. Stay tuned. If you're not already subscribing, please subscribe here on YouTube. You can also click like and share on all your social media. We're a new show, as you know, so it really just comes down to supporting independent media in crazy times like this, supporting us at places like patreon.com/The Nomiki Show, where patrons get early access to all of our shows, extended interviews, swag, and some special interviews as well. So make sure to check it out. What is all the fuss over the New York presidential primary right now? This week, a federal judge reversed a move by the New York State Board of Elections to cancel the Excelsior State's presidential primary, which coincides with the down-ballot primaries. Now, prior to this year, primary dates for different offices fell at different times of the year. April for presidential, June for federal, congressional, and September for state races. But now that the New York Senate is truly Democratic, the primary dates are consolidated to one date at the end of June. For this to happen, it took a movement coalition to defeat Governor Andrew Cuomo's IDC, the Independent Democratic Conference, the 8 Senate Democrats literally caucusing with the Republicans, preventing the Senate from having a true majority and thus holding up progress and electoral reforms. Now, even though New York is a Democratic state, the Democratic Party's love language is Tammany Hall machine politics. With the second lowest turnout in the country, just above Republican Louisiana, New York lawmakers may have resisted these electoral reforms as it meant it protected their power. The more restrictive the voting laws, the more protected an incumbent. So this presidential primary fight is layered, and it's about a few things. Number one, democracy, and voters being able to exercise their rights. Number two, delegates to the Democratic Convention. Number three, keeping hard-fought oversight and electoral reforms. And number four, Andrew Yang's political career. So politics makes strange bedfellows. So I'll start with Andrew Yang's intentions here in leading and partnering with the Bernie campaign with the appeals lawsuit against the New York State Board of Elections' decision to cancel the primary. So Andrew Yang is nowhere near earning enough delegates to win any power at the DNC. So this seems to be a political move to keep his name in the press, keep growing his email list, and earn some love from the Bernie left, especially after he endorsed Biden. There have been rumors that he's running for New York City mayor, which is next year. Even Bloomberg himself pushed that out. And given the candidates that are currently running for mayor in New York, there's actually a real opportunity for a progressive national name to swoop in and create their own lane and clear political faction. If Biden is likely to win New York by a large margin and is the presumptive nominee, then why on earth is the establishment pushing back so hard? Biden, he's going to get his delegates. So why are they still kicking the movement down? Is it ego? Maybe. Is it to flex power? Maybe. Well, it's my duty to remind you regularly on our PSA that Andrew Cuomo's ability is that he controls all mechanisms of the party and much of the state. The Board of Elections was able to cancel the primary based on a loophole in this year's passed budget written and designed by Governor Cuomo, a budget that was passed swiftly in the shadows because of the COVID crisis. Now, this budget process was how Cuomo best used his IDC, when it still existed, in blocking progress and reforms. So the Board of Elections cancels the primary because of the budget loophole, and as a result, in one move, Andrew Cuomo not only hurts all down-ballot progressive grassroots challengers who depended on progressive voters turning out to vote for Bernie, but he also blocked New York delegates from winning spots to the national convention, which is scheduled for August. Now, the down-ballot progressive challengers are facing an uphill battle without the ability to knock on doors right now during COVID. They most likely don't have the name ID. They can't send out community relations government mail as they're not in office. And they probably can't afford to buy television ads or spend millions of dollars getting their message out in the media. So it is an uphill battle already for these candidates. Yet, these are unpredictable times, and the establishment does not want to show that they have any weakness, especially right now. That is machine politics at its finest. Now, as for the convention, as someone who has been a delegate, served on the platform committee and the Unity Reform Commission, I have admittedly thought to myself, what is the point of a convention right now when we know who's probably going to be the nominee? The platform is meaningless if the Democrats don't live by it. So why do we go through all this fuss? Why get on the ballot, run for delegate? Why organize people to vote? Why fundraise to go to the convention and share hotel rooms and then get into a room and debate these horrible people? What is all the fuss? Well, it turns out that the reforms we did pass on the Unity Reform Commission, it expires at this convention. And the more delegates that Bernie has, the bigger the fight at the convention to keep the reforms. I know, I've read the comments. It doesn't feel like there were any reforms, but we wouldn't have had Bernie in this position as a finalist if these reforms did not happen. And trust me, they came with a brutal fight, and they should have gone way further. But all of that progress, the progress of building a coalition of reformers in the party who didn't support Bernie but wanted the reforms, we've been fighting them for years, the progress of having open primaries and more transparent caucuses and more inclusive party, that will all be reversed. And the New York delegation, it's huge. The New York delegation got Perez elected. And the machine, they don't want that reform, especially with so many New York DNC members working with Biden right now and Cuomo. So this is what it's all about. It's about sticking it to the DNC. And for the establishment, it's about reversing all the reforms to stick it to us, the movement. It's about Cuomo controlling the party, likely to set the stage for his run in 2024. God help us. There are supposed to be 1.5 million applications sent first, 3 million ballots eventually sent. 20,000 military ballots have already been sent out, and people are just confused. Is this primary happening? Does it even matter? Folks are sick, tired, worried, fed up, exhausted. There's no progressive coalition really fighting this, as the WFP, which is based in New York, is its own party, and they want to keep people voting on their line. It's a mess. If people write in Bernie, does he get delegates? Will the convention even happen? It's still scheduled in person, but that's looking extremely irresponsible. So what is the lesson here? My biggest takeaway from covering and being involved with the DNC is that they maintain their power when they operate in darkness and drag out debates through confusing process and endless committee meetings. The press doesn't understand the DNC rules and the committees. The DNC members don't understand them. But you know who does? The consultants who run the show. The consultants who work with the military-industrial complex, oil and fracking companies, pharmaceutical companies, health insurance companies, union-busting companies, charter schools, the private prison industry, and Republicans too. It's not easy to follow process, but the primary cancellation is a clear example as to why we always need to have our eyes open. They control the marketplace by controlling the rules of power. At this point, at this very point, we have no choice but to fight back.
Years ago, the banks drew a red line around the South Bronx because immigrants and Black and Latino families lived here. The money stopped, the people got poor, and the landlords burned them out of their homes for the insurance money. But to a 10-year-old girl who spent 3 years with her mom and baby brother in a Brooklyn homeless shelter, our first real home inside that Bronx red line was beautiful. Boogie Down, the birthplace of hip hop. All that magic and all these people got redlined in. We were an island of salsa music, block parties, y la revolución. From the young lords to the people who rebuilt their blocks, brick by brick, building by building. Our people stayed to fight. Survival, resilience, creativity. That's what the South Bronx is. But we've been sold out by the political establishment and the greedy developers who fund them. And our own community leaders are complicit, taking their money and helping them steal our homes. Housing is a universal human right, but because of racist housing practices like redlining, America needs a homes guarantee. But that's not enough. We need Medicare for all and a Green New Deal. I've spent my life fighting for this community. Working people, single parents, the elderly, the poor, people who ride the bus and work 2 jobs. They're the most powerful people I know. I'd be the only member of Congress to have grown up homeless in New York City. I remember that 10-year-old girl, humiliated that she lives in a shelter, who promised herself that she'd do anything to keep other families from feeling that shame, who found her first home in the South Bronx and became the daughter of a revolution. I'm Samelys López, and I'm running for Congress because the South Bronx saved my life, and there's nothing I won't do to save my home.
As you all know, who are frequent viewers and listeners to the show, we like to profile grassroots candidates who are challenging the establishment and the status quo, not taking corporate money, and, you know, it would be great if they're women as well because they have other obstacles that most candidates don't face. Our next guest is one of our matriarch candidates. I am one of the board members of Matriarch, which is an organization dedicated to supporting working class progressive women running for Congress. And now that all of these candidates are campaigning from home, they're facing new obstacles. And this is a moment that is even more important to support grassroots candidates because they're not able to go out and knock on doors. And they're going to be competing with big money already. So we want to make sure that they get a lot of attention, that their stories get out there, and that we support them in any way we can. So our guest is Samelys López, who is from the Bronx in New York. She is running for an open seat right now. It's a congressional seat, the 15th district in New York, and it mainly encompasses the Bronx. So Samelys, thank you for joining us. And I know you're campaigning like crazy and on the phones all the time, so it means a lot.
No, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me on. And thank you so much for supporting working class women of color with your organization, Matriarch. It's made a difference for me and in the lives of many other people running in this congressional cycle.
Thank you. I think, it's important that we all, in whatever way we can do our part. And I'm just grateful to be a part of a coalition of women that are giving whatever they can with their limited time to these candidates that they know are facing a lot of difficulty pre-COVID. And it really does require all hands on deck, even if it's just a little bit of your time. So we're just grateful to have worked with you. So, before we get to like what it's like campaigning right now, because it's crazy. Can you tell us a little bit about just your background so people get to know who you are and then why you're running for this seat in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Puerto Rican and Dominican. I was born in Puerto Rico. My mom is Dominican. She divorced my dad when I was around 2 years old, and we came to this country around the time that I was 2 or 3 years old, and she worked at the seamstress to make ends meet. So she worked 12-hour days to survive. She's also a domestic violence survivor, and because of that situation, we ended up in the homeless shelter to escape what was going on at home. So that was my reality. That was where my brother was born. So my early experiences with all these issues, which is not unique only to our family, but to many families that are in the 15th Congressional District, really inspired me to pursue social justice, activism, community organizing, to rectify those imbalances and those injustices in society. And my mother's experience and the experiences of many people in my community is really the lens through which I see the world. So we need to continue to fight to center directly impacted people, the most marginalized and most oppressed in the community. And because of those earlier experiences, I ended up dedicating my professional life to building housing in the Bronx and in New York City. So I have a background as an affordable housing planner, and I have a master's in urban planning with a focus in community housing development from the Wagner School of Public Service. So I came from struggle, very humble beginnings, and I was able to, make something of myself and give back. And, the unfortunate thing that I saw when I went to the institutions that I went to for school is the great imbalances that exist in our society. And it was in school that I recognized that there were so many privileged people in our country, in our communities, that have never experienced the things that my community and I have experienced. So there's definitely a need for us to, rectify that situation and make sure that we level the playing field, but, for everybody, and make sure that we invest in our collective goods and spaces, in our public schools, our housing stock, and take away from the rich to, give to the masses, because it's the workers that create the wealth in this country. And if there's anything that the coronavirus has, shown, is that it's really the frontline workers in our society that are keeping this country afloat. And we need to come up with a system that recognizes that and honors their commitment and their struggle.
It's interesting you say that, because I think a lot of folks who are listening and watching relate to your experiences. I know I do myself, where you go to college and you're surrounded by folks and you're learning about some of these massive policy or politics in any way. And even, in activist groups at these institutions. And there is a little bit of a disconnect oftentimes, because people who can afford to go to these institutions, who may not be there on scholarship or have had similar experiences, they don't relate in the same way. It doesn't mean that they don't have the right intentions, but there is a truly different experience when you come at it from your personal life. And I think that's what's actually powerful about Matriarch is when we were going through the nominations, it was hearing the personal stories all of the candidates faced and how it related directly to their mission in running for Congress. So you're running in this very crowded primary. Jose Serrano is the congressman, and the seat is opening up, and he's retiring because of an illness. And there are a lot of existing lawmakers in this race. There are people who've run many times for other positions. And you've been, even though a lot of these folks say they're progressive and, might be on like 85% of the issues, or even 90% if they're like in the city council. It's interesting because real estate is the factor that like nobody wants to touch. And you have positioned yourself not only as a housing advocate who's worked in this space, and it's how we met, through activism, but through your own, you're not taking that money. And DSA's endorsed you, Matriarch's endorsed you, AOC has endorsed you. How is that becoming an issue more and more in New York, especially in your district? Why does it matter in the Bronx specifically?
Absolutely. So the Bronx is experiencing a gentrification and a displacement crisis in the community. So there is a connection between big money and politics and real estate and lack of affordable housing. So it's really important to take big money out of politics, because we can't afford to send people, to places of power where they're going to be advocating for the special interests that put them there. We need to advocate for working class communities. We need to create housing opportunities. We need to decommodify housing and decommodify politics, decommodify, a lot of the institutions that oppress us and refuse to take money from oppressive forces that keep our communities down. And New York is a real estate town, unfortunately. And a lot of politicians, not only running in this race, and beyond, we're seeing that in the country as well, are beholden to real estate interests. So we need to target land speculative practices that artificially inflate the cost of rent. And if you're taking huge sums of money from real estate developers that have a history of being really greedy, right? You're probably not the best advocate for creating affordable housing opportunities for all New Yorkers and in communities like the Bronx that need it. So what that does is it gives you the freedom and independence to call things as they are and just talk about it, with a real sense of authenticity while centering the needs of the most directly impacted people. So that is what we are doing in our race. And we've rejected real estate developer funding. We've rejected taking money from contractors that steal wages from workers. There's some people in this race doing that.
Wow.
And we've rejected corporate PAC money and pharmaceutical money to finance our campaign, because the way that you fundraise has everything about the values that you believe in.
Absolutely. You know, it's great to see more of a trend, and that candidates can raise money through crowdsourced donations, individual donations, that's able to get them on the map. But it's still a struggle when you're a grassroots candidate running against, how many opponents do you have? 17?
I lost track now.
Yeah, there's a lot. Not let's be fair, not all of them have like full on campaigns, but because, you know, people run for different reasons. But you have a lot of opponents, and, you know, they're in a money arms race. Like they're really fighting so that they can buy television ads and radio ads and mail pieces if they're lawmakers and they overlap with the district that you're running in. Not all of them do. You know, they can use their offices to educate people about COVID and what they're doing. And so there's so many machinations behind the scenes. And I think that's what's so refreshing about you is you're not depending on these tricks, these old school political tricks to get your message out, and it's clicked. You know, people are hearing your voice and seeing how it's unique and that you believe and connect with your district. But that leads me to the next question, which is, now that you're not out knocking on doors, which was fantastic, right? You were having a great impact.
Oh, it's the time of my life.
Yeah. So like now how do you do it?
Right. So we've shifted from door-to-door organizing, obviously in light of the coronavirus epidemic, because we're prioritizing public safety. So now we are organizing in the digital space, and we are phone banking, text banking, and engaging in mutual aid efforts to check up on our neighbors. So using our campaign infrastructure that we've already built to check in on constituents in the district and figure out what they need, and essentially do a survey of, you know, what they're going through and connect them to resources. We also updated our website to come up with a platform of coronavirus related demands. So coronavirus and the social safety net. We released that on March 19th of this year in light of what was going on. And we also updated our website to come up with local resources so that people can tap into things like food banks and resources to help them navigate public benefits and unemployment insurance and things like that. Really like the bread and butter issues that people care about, since there's so many people right now that are out of a job and, you know, they're just having trouble making ends meet and putting food on the table. So we're using our campaign as an information resource hub for the community, and we're using our call time to reach out to people in need and connect them to resources and eliminate red tape.
Call time, for those who don't know, is where a candidate makes calls to constituents or otherwise to raise money. Pretty much every candidate has to do it. Doesn't mean you're going for the big money. It means you're just trying to raise money to put your campaign together. With that being said, you know, I think a lot of folks do want to find out. They're probably moved by your campaign. You were profiled recently in The Intercept. You've been profiled many times. The New York Times profiled you and how you have personally, you know, you've got your own personal story as you're running. You know, do you want to talk a little bit about like what it means for you as a human being, as an American to run, and what makes you unique from maybe other candidates who have a little bit more of a security net in place?
Oh, absolutely. We need more working class people from communities of color like me, like many people probably watching the show, to run, because that's how we're going to transform this country and center our stories that we've been through. I feel like there's more of a need in that in our government. And that's what makes people like me unique and others. We need to center those experiences in government and these conversations, because it's missing right now. I feel like places like Congress are dominated by white men. It's dominated by corporations, lobbyists. There's really no place for people like us to have a voice. And luckily, you have, you know, people like AOC and others that are really paving the way and leading courageously on these issues. So we need to support that kind of leadership. We need to step away and reject broken, you know, transactional political system that currently defines our, you know, political environment, and embrace the politics of transformation. So that's what our campaign is about, and many other similar campaigns throughout the country. And I'm so grateful that I have the support of organizations like Matriarch, all the organizations that have endorsed us. Many people in the community, respect what, we're about, and they see our campaign and our struggle reflected in their daily life, because they feel that that's something that's going to keep you grounded in community, and it's going to help you stay focused and reject and continue to reject special interest, funding, and influence, so that we can remain true to the community. And I think that's what people want to see. They want to see somebody who has lived through what they've been through, who's going to stay the course and advocate unapologetically no matter what. And, part of what helps people like me do that is the fact that I've been through it and I've seen it firsthand, and I've experienced what oppression feels like, what it tastes like. So it's just really important to have more people like that, and to be intentional about creating spaces for directly impacted people to shape policy, because oftentimes it comes from an ivory tower.
Right.
And it comes out, from out of nowhere, and it doesn't really make sense for people on the ground, but it's important for people to shape policy, because when you focus on that and you focus on creating policy that addresses the needs of the most marginalized in society, everybody benefits.
And they also understand the immediacy of some of the delays out of the corona crisis have been outrageous. I mean, to see that congressmen and women don't understand, I mean, let's remember, the majority of them are millionaires. They don't know what it's like to be uninsured. They don't know what it's like to have your insurance tied to employment when we're about to hit record slowly. And to see them say $1,200 is enough. I mean, in most parts of America, it's actually not enough. It's definitely not enough in New York, no matter where you're from in New York, because the rent is high, and not to mention the food costs are high in New York. So it's, I think having, voices like yourself, where you like know what it's like to be, forget about middle class is facing these obstacles right now. Working class and working poor and undocumented people it's a whole other level. And if you're formerly incarcerated, there are other levels of restrictions. So to have people who directly relate, who have firsthand experience and probably secondhand experience to add to it, they understand the immediacy of needing to get it done ASAP versus later. And you hear it in their voices. Like, I hear it in your voice. I can only imagine what that voice sounds like in a room full of millionaires when you're representing your district, it's the poorest district in the country. Am I correct?
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, we have a dire set of economic challenges. And for me and in my campaign, my experience is really about life and death. That's really how it needs to be centered. Because places like the Bronx have been disinvested in for decades. We've experienced environmental racism through the built environment. The way that the highways are cut up have polluted our lungs and have made us even more likely to get the coronavirus, because if you have asthma, if you have an underlying symptom, right, whether it's diabetes, a respiratory illness, you're more likely to get it. So the way that our communities have been set up, especially people that live in the South Bronx, we have to, end that inequality and call it out. And now is a better time than ever to be very urgent and bold in our vision for change, because what we're seeing right now is that the current capitalist system that we have right now is not working for us anymore. And we need to re-envision something different that centers the needs of directly impacted people and centers our demands, especially in light of an epidemic.
And having, we have to remember that AOC and Ilhan and Pramila Jayapal and Rashida and Deb Haaland, they're only as strong as their numbers are in Congress. So it's great to have those voices, but they need more of them. I mean, it's one thing that Ro Khanna always says. He's like, we need more progressives. Help us find more progressives to run and win, because then you become a unit. And it's not, the Progressive Caucus, there are all different types of progressives in the Progressive Caucus, some that are much more progressive than others. But, to have more that come from this experience, it become like you have several voices that can echo each other and back each other up. And then, of course, that turns into votes, and that influences how Nancy Pelosi responds to things. So we want to see you elected. You would be, I believe you're a millennial. You're right. You're a former Bernie delegate. We know each other from the Bernie campaign, probably even prior, but got to know you there. And you've been a longtime activist in progressive politics. And And I think it's important to say that, you know what it's like to have student debt. You're uninsured while you're running. People don't understand what goes on when you're running. You're not taking in money. There's a reason why they're all millionaires. They can afford to run.
It's stressful.
Yeah.
It's stressful. And it can be a very lonely experience. So that's why we have to increase the number of people that are in these positions to back, champions like, the squad members and, similar people, because it's incredibly lonely experience when you're fighting for change. And we need to fight for things like a homes guarantee, universal health care, because healthcare should not be tied to whether you have a job or not. Because right now with the coronavirus epidemic, so many people don't have jobs. So it should be something that we should fight for as a human right. And this epidemic is showing to people that this is where we need to go. And we need to continue to be vocal about taking big money out of politics. It's just the only way.
It should be a non-negotiable.
Yeah, non-negotiable.
You can't answer to the people and to pharmaceutical company. It just doesn't work that way. Samelys, where can people learn about you? So make sure to have it up on the screen. We'll have your website and everything. But if you had one task that everybody could help out with right now, what could they do?
I would say definitely go to our website, lopezforthepeople.com, sign up to help us phone bank, to check in on our neighbors, help us text bank, help us spread the word, share our campaign video. Maybe you can share our campaign video too, Nomiki.
Yes.
That talks a little bit about my experiences and highlights the beauty of the South Bronx, because even though we are the poorest congressional district in the country, there's a lot of innovation, a lot of beauty that this community can share with the world. And I think that it's time for the South Bronx to be seen as a local, policy thought leader, because there's a lot of solutions here that can be implemented, not only locally, but, nationally and globally. So I definitely encourage you to look up the South Bronx, look up the district, go to lopezforthepeople.com, sign up to volunteer and donate, because we can use the support since we're moving into a digital space right now, so that we can
phone
organize.
calls, all that kind of stuff. You guys have the best food. And I say that from Queens, which I think was actually noted as the best food in the country, but I'll give you guys, you got some good food there.
Oh, you have some street cred? Okay, I didn't know you had street cred.
Oh, Queens was literally labeled one of the best food places in the country, because it's just the diversity. I mean, the Bronx is just as diverse.
Queens has some good food.
Yeah. It's based on diversity. I mean, that's ultimately it. It's great. Samelys, love you, sister.
Love you too. Muchas gracias.
De nada.
Cuídate. Bye.
If you're not already subscribing to us on Patreon, you're missing out, because not only do you get our show early, which is great, especially in moments like this when news is changing so quickly, but you also get special access to interviews, extended interviews, and swag. We have new mugs and bags and stickers. Oh my. So make sure to check us out on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. But you can also just subscribe on YouTube, because that is a way for us to grow and get the word out. So subscribe, click like, the alert button on there as well, and share on all of your social media platforms. You know the line, history repeats itself. Well, our next guest wrote a book about a moment that, oh God, it's just so similar to now. John Nichols is the national affairs correspondent at The Nation magazine, of course, and he is the author of many books. The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party is the one that I'm talking about right now. Fun fact, I met you for the first time, John. You definitely don't remember this. Over 10 years ago when you wrote that book about journalism. I don't have it in front of me right now.
Death and Life of American Journalism.
That was it. Yeah. It was a brilliant book. I definitely recommend it to folks to take a look at it. But you were on a book tour, and I met you in line, and I talked to you for a little bit, and I don't remember what I said, and I don't remember what you said, but I knew I liked you.
Well, and we've been together in a lot of circumstances over the years. I think especially of the summits that were put together by National Nurses United, and some of these really powerful events where you saw a lot of progressives, and you were always and have always been such a good presence.
Thank you. I appreciate that, John. So, oh God, the timing of this book is brilliant. It's almost like you saw this coming. Okay, so the Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party, this is something that I've personally been involved in, in so many ways in the last few years with the Sanders campaign on the Unity Reform Commission at the DNC. And here we are, Bernie Sanders is not the nominee anymore, or not the nominee at all. And the party is really doing what it does well, ignoring progressives. Once again, as we sit at this moment, Joe Biden has very credible, corroborated allegations, Me Too allegations against him, sexual assault allegations from a former aide. The mainstream media, corporate media, is now picking up on it, and there's silence from women's groups. There's silence from, a lot of folks, except for maybe some key surrogates or people who want to be vice president, saying that essentially that they don't believe her. So I think it's really tough right now for progressives and feminists to digest this all and say, okay, I'm going to vote for Joe Biden because, Donald Trump has cut the CDC. I mean, it's a tough call. So I guess my first question is, before we delve into the book, how much of this did you predict?
In the book or just in general?
Just in general.
Well, I don't claim to be any kind of seer. I cover politics, and I've covered it for a very long time. And my sort of side habit is to be a bit of a historian. And so at the end of the day, I hate to say that a lot of this was predictable, but an awful lot was, and an awful lot is. And one of the reasons that I decided to do the book was because of Trump and this reality of Donald Trump. And I had for many years thought about doing a book on the Republican Party, this wonderful, marvelous political entity. And it is a Republican Party, a party that was forged in the 1850s by radicals, and including socialists who really wanted to kind of break out of the political boundaries of America, and briefly did, forcing the issue of slavery, the fundamental sin of the American experiment, but also forcing land reform, the Homestead Act, and things like that. And I wanted to figure out, how did this Republican Party end up so horrific? Right. How did it become what it is? And then I realized the answer to the question wasn't in the Republican Party. The answer was in the Democratic Party. And that the Democratic Party had, and it has repeatedly over decades, failed to position itself as a party that was principled enough and visionary enough to just triumph over the Republicans. And they're, look, that's the thing you have to be honest about. The Republican Party has made itself incredibly unappealing, like strikingly, shockingly unappealing, to the point where they now have Donald Trump in charge, right? And you say, well, how can you not beat these people, right? And the answer, of course, is that when you pull your punches repeatedly, not in the current moment, but over generations, and you push aside your principled leaders and you marginalize them and you marginalize their ideas, you slow the arc of history. You slow the progress, and you put yourself in a position where you are not a sufficient challenger, a sufficient opposition to, in this case, a Republican Party that's gone off the rails. And so really, that's what took me in. And so I hate to tell you that when I started writing the book, I did in fact anticipate, or at least want to explore, a deeper challenge with the Democratic Party.
So much of this book, goes back 75 years to FDR. And I mean, even if you were to anticipate this scenario, this political scenario with Bernie Sanders, I think it would be extremely hard to anticipate a situation in which the economy would collapse, likely collapse, in a moment's notice because of failures in dealing with a pandemic. So, there's a lot of talk of FDR right now and Four Freedoms and Biden rising to the level of leadership needed to be an antithesis to Donald Trump at this moment, to have real solutions to get us out of this economy. I mean, there is some sort of like bare minimum that the Democrats do to keep some form of stabilization, and especially when Republicans have just gone too far. I mean, with the Iraq War is a perfect example. Barack Obama, extraordinary candidate, but probably Democrats wouldn't have done so well if the Republicans hadn't been so weak at that time and hadn't put forward such a weak candidate. So with that being said, 75 years ago, you have Henry Wallace, you have FDR. For those who are not familiar with him, can you talk a little bit about what happened?
Sure. I mean, and I think this is exactly the place to frame it. We are in a moment right now that in many senses challenges us as we have never been challenged before, but in other senses pulls together elements that we have seen many, many times. My mother is in her 80s, and I was talking to her about the coronavirus pandemic and all the challenges related to it. And she says, "Oh, I've seen this before." And I said, "Mom, you're not old enough to have been alive for the 1918 flu pandemic." And she was like, and she's very sharp. She goes, "Oh, you don't know about the 1936 epidemic of, scarlet fever in rural Wisconsin." And she started telling a story that was, social distancing, stores closed, delivering food to, her dad was a grocer, delivering food to the front steps of people who couldn't pay because they didn't have jobs. And I'm suddenly like, okay, maybe we aren't so far. And so then the question is, can politics, not government, we always talk about government. No, can politics get us to a point where we could respond sufficiently to such an overwhelming moment? Well, what happened in the 1930s was that the Democratic Party, which was a boss-driven party, and in many ways a horrible coalition, right? It had plenty of progressives in it, but it also had Southern segregationists, really bad players, big city bosses who were as crooked as can be, this whole amalgam. And they got so desperate at a certain point that they picked a son of privilege, Franklin Roosevelt. He was a wealthy guy who served a couple of years as the governor of New York, but was a good communicator. And they put him on the ballot. They had a great election. They won the House, the Senate, the presidency, swept into power. And the truth is that Roosevelt came to power as an okay guy, not the guy that we talk about now. He was okay. Right. But there were mass movements at the time, incredible movements. The movement of the unemployed, which is way underestimated. The movement of nascent labor unions. Really the seeds of the civil rights movement, which you can really track back into that period with the rise of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and other groups. And then one other interesting thing, a really strong socialist party. Mm-hmm. Norman Thomas got almost 1 million votes in 1932. Franklin Roosevelt was scared. He saw his left moving, and he saw his left moving outside the Democratic Party. And so Roosevelt made a lot of moves to the left. And one of the things that he did that was fascinating was he brought in a farm editor from rural Iowa, a guy who had been a La Follette progressive, who had been very involved in progressive populist movements in the upper Midwest, Henry Wallace. And Wallace was handsome, dynamic, a great intellectual, never had run for public office ever. But Roosevelt knew that he was very, very popular. He was trusted by small farmers across the Midwest because he edited a farm journal. So Roosevelt put him in charge of the Department of Agriculture. And the Department of Agriculture, I know people today would have a hard time imagining this, but it was the dynamic engine of the New Deal. It was out of the Department of Agriculture that all these rural programs and many urban programs developed. Yeah. So fast forward, in 1940, after 8 years as president, Franklin Roosevelt knew he faced an incredible challenge as he sought a third term, first president ever to do it. And he pushed aside his Southern, very conservative vice president, John Nance Garner, and he said to the Democratic Party, "I will not accept your nomination for a third term unless you give me Henry Wallace as my running mate." And he knew exactly what he was doing. He knew America was headed toward World War II. He knew that we were still going to have all the economic challenges. He needed a dynamic, young, progressive, radical at his side. And what Wallace brought to that ticket, the energy, the hope, the vision, cannot be underestimated. And I won't tell you, go beyond it to a whole big story, but I'll tell you one final element. The second Wallace got in there and Roosevelt gave him a lot of role in making the war work. And he did things like say that people working in war industries needed a living wage. Mm-hmm. He supported integration of the industries. He supported treating people in other countries, farm workers in other countries who were producing products fairly and giving them a decent wage. I mean, it was just, and that so horrified the elites, the power elites within the administration, because Roosevelt had a team of rivals that they constantly manipulated to marginalize Wallace. The media went after him in all sorts of ways. But Wallace just kept on going. And his great vision was that we would beat fascism in Europe, and then we would take that energy and bring it home to America to beat racism and sexism at home. And you cannot begin to imagine the quality of the speeches he gave in 1942, 1943, anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist. And then when there was a race riot in Detroit in 1943, where a number of African Americans who had come into these defense industries were killed, he flew personally to Detroit, organized a rally with trade unionists, thousands of African American and Latino and white trade unionists, and told that rally, if you accept racism, if you accept segregation, if you accept violence against working class people of color coming into our industries, then you're the same as the people we're fighting against.
Right.
And that message horrified the New York Times. It horrified the elites within the party. And the bottom line story is that in 1944, and we can go deeper into it if you want, they pushed Henry Wallace aside. They marginalized him, prevented him from being the nominee for a fourth term for Roosevelt. And within months after that happened, Roosevelt passed. Mm-hmm. And we lost a potential president who was determined to use the post-war era immediately to fight for an end to racism, to treat the women who had gone into the factories and the Rosie the Riveters with respect, to expand the number of jobs, to have a massive housing program, and frankly, as difficult as it was, to try and seek peace with the Soviet Union rather than a Cold War.
Instead, we got Harry Truman. So when you talk about these elites that pushed him out, I mean, you've said so many things right now. I'm like, oh my God, talk about this moment. Asking the Democratic Party, the supposed party that stands with, women, believes women, and Me Too, and Hillary Clinton endorsing Joe Biden the day CNN covers the Joe Biden sexual assault allegation. Women's groups, as I said earlier, on the sideline, like not talking about this, or even, not even issuing a statement. This is the party that is supposed to represent all these things. We literally had a woman on the ticket last time who fought for these things, and she's now endorsing this man who I think a lot of people know they don't even really like each other personally. But with that being said, I mean, it just, I'm not so sure if this is like history repeating itself, or if it's just they have their tactics to make sure that they maintain power. Mm-hmm. So so when you talk about marginalizing the left and pushing out Wallace, what actually happened?
Sure. Well, first off, they marginalized him within power. And this is the interesting thing. I don't think people on the left are as conscious of how well organized and how, frankly, meticulous and pretty capable power is. And when I talk about power, I'm talking about economic power. I'm talking about a status quo power. And, when you talk about a team of rivals administration, yes, Franklin Roosevelt was up there talking about 4 freedoms and then an economic bill of rights. And we can have great regard for Roosevelt in many ways, despite his failures. And there were plenty of them. But the fact of the matter is that within Roosevelt's administration, there were some very conservative folks. And there were Southern folks, segregationists, and others who, had an influence. There were also corporate folks and bankers. And they feared Wallace tremendously. And so they worked within the administration to marginalize him. He was pushed out of key positions that Roosevelt had given him. In fact, positions in which he played a very, very vital role in pulling the administration of the country together during World War II. And by 1943, he was actually quite marginalized within the administration. They didn't want him to be the vice president for the fourth term. They knew Roosevelt was ailing. They knew, all the possible threats. And of course, as you know, when you talk, Roosevelt was not that old a man, but he had genuine health concerns. Yeah. And so they wanted somebody else as vice president. It was as simple as that. And there's the fascinating thing. And I do think this is a lesson for the contemporary left. Wallace was marginalized by the summer of 1943, and they thought they had finished him off. And he then said, okay, we're going to have a little fight here. I'm ready for the fight. And he traveled across the United States to basically everywhere you can imagine at his own expense. And with a wink and a nod from Roosevelt, who clearly liked Wallace and clearly valued what Wallace was bringing to it, and also with quite a bit of support from trade unions. And Nomiki, if you could look at the schedule of his trips, he would go to Los Angeles and meet with members of the Jewish community who were concerned about what was happening in Europe, and get their messages, get their information. He would meet with Mexican Americans who were organizing in the defense industries. He would meet with African Americans who were actively fighting for civil rights at that time in the midst of this war effort. And instead of telling them, oh, you have to shut up, you have to get on board, and, do it, say, no, what you're saying is valuable. This will strengthen what we are trying to do. And he kept bringing all these people together, bringing all this information together, and frankly, rallying people. And by the spring of 1944, instead of being marginalized, the Gallup poll showed he was the most popular choice for vice president by a mile. Have you ever heard of something like that before? And it was clear there was this incredible enthusiasm for the guy. The expanding coalition, again, have you ever heard that before? The expanding coalition really liked him, all the people they were bringing in. And so they didn't want him to be anywhere near the convention. The convention was very boss controlled. Roosevelt, because he was in the midst of fighting a war, and you can't imagine, I read his diaries in doing the book, how overwhelming that was. And so Roosevelt basically said to the party, look, I'm going to send a letter to the convention that says if I was a delegate, I'd vote for Henry Wallace.
Wow.
And he did. He sent that letter. But the bosses all said, well, you didn't really mean that, And he also said that if it isn't Wallace, he could accept maybe like Harry Truman or somebody like that. So there's all this manipulation going on. They didn't want Wallace anywhere near the convention. But he said, you know what? And I know what's going on here. I'd like to at least be able to nominate Franklin Roosevelt for a fourth term. They said, no, you can't nominate him, but we'll let you second the nomination. Oh my God. And he arrived, had a by train from Iowa with his bag, carrying his own bag, checked into his hotel, went to the convention, stood up on the podium, and said that he was there to nominate Franklin Roosevelt for another term, but he was also there to say that the Democratic Party would only win as a fighting progressive party that opposed racism. And he called out the poll tax. He called out the Southern segregationists who were on the floor of that convention, who were literally trying to stop him. And instead of turning everybody off, he brought tears to people's eyes. They realized, because there was this great mix of people there, that this was a moral call to arms. The convention went wild. When Roosevelt was, in fact, not renominated, there was a floor demonstration for Wallace. He was getting out of control. Claude Pepper, then a senator from Florida, who was on Wallace's side, started fighting his way toward the stage because he knew that if he could get to the microphone, he would be able to call for a unanimous consent, if you will, to renominate the full ticket, Roosevelt and Wallace. And the Brotherhood of Maintenance of the Way, railroad workers were controlling the gate to get up to the stage. They were trade unionists. They liked Wallace. And so they let Pepper through. And Pepper was fighting his way up the stage. He's this little tiny guy. And he's fighting his way up the stage. And literally the bosses, men were blocking him and pushing him back. He was within a matter of feet from the microphone, matter of feet away from changing the history of the United States and the world.
Oh my God.
And the big boss of the convention screamed shut it down. And the chairman of the convention, who was actually a friend of Wallace's, but was kind of terrified by everything that was going on, called for an adjourn. He said, there's been a call to adjourn the convention. And the convention screamed, no. They wanted to go on. And he said, I hear an A.
Oh my God.
Gavelled the convention out of order, closed it down. And through that night, through the next 24 hours, dozens of deals were made, promises, money, the whole bit. And the next day, when the convention reconvened with different tickets, so that all the grassroots folks who had been there for Wallace the day before couldn't get in, Wallace still won the initial vote, but they had repeated votes, and he was eventually pushed out.
This is, I mean, it is believable. I have a flashback of, just, you know, I would love to hear your thought on this one. I have a flashback of the New York State Democratic Party convention in 2016, in which we tried to nominate a different chair for the delegation. Not something that's controversial at all, because it, you know, at the end of the day, yes, we knew we were going to go into the convention with a certain number of delegates, and that, you know, with that, we could push forward different reforms. And of course, Bernie gave up the delegates to have the Unity Reform Commission, which I ended up sitting on later. But at the New York State Convention, which was a few months prior in New York, we several of us stood up in this room of maybe 50 people and said, you know, we call for nomination, and the chair, or the parliamentarian, I believe, or whoever it was at the time, you know, said that he didn't hear it, and he adjourned the meeting, and he nominated Andrew Cuomo, even though there were multiple people standing up. So this is documented, I went to the stage, I rushed to the stage. My friend Momita, who was also a delegate, was right behind me, and I grabbed the microphone.
Oh my gosh, this is very
Not kidding you. I know, that's why I'm telling the story, and it's all live streamed too. I grabbed the microphone and I started talking. I said, there was a nomination there. There was a nomination there. How could you not hear? You're 4 feet away. And they shut the microphone off. And I walked up to the guy who was controlling the mic. I said, you shut off my microphone. And it was on camera. And then one of the delegates, who was older, a Clinton delegate, took his cane and hit my friend Momita, who was one of our delegates, who was live streaming, and it was on camera. And wow. I mean, this is the kind of thing, like, as much as the National Party can't get away with, hopefully not get away with things like this, it still happens. I mean, this is New York. New York has not changed much. It's Andrew Cuomo's party, and you're not part of it.
Well, Nomiki, though, in writing the book, the book begins with several chapters on Wallace and these stories. There's one chapter that actually, I went through the minutes of the convention and all the diaries of the people that were involved. So I actually found the exact minute at night when they gavelled it out. So we knew exactly the minute that history was changed. And that doesn't happen very often.
When was it? Now I feel like I should have been writing journals. Damn it!
No, it's a pretty interesting thing. I've got the book here, and it makes a fine read, as well as a great holiday gift. No, the chapter is July 20th, 1944, 10:55 p.m. That's the moment. I had the notes of the convention. And you know what was interesting was that in writing this, obviously I deal with this, and frankly, I want to make a big deal, mid-sized deal at least, of saying Henry Wallace wasn't a perfect guy.
Right.
He made plenty of mistakes, and we can talk about all of them if you want. He acknowledged them right up front. He was really good at admitting his mistakes. But I say that to, you know, not to get into too much hero worship or anything, but he was the right man for the moment, and he would have been the right man for the times. And I take the book forward, going through right up to the current moment. And I can't tell you how many times microphones got shut off, or doors got shut, or rules got changed, or new groups were formed, or new messages delivered. And this kind of, it's not always, I don't want to say constant, because there were times where progressives broke through, but so frequently when they broke through, they were pushed back and marginalized. And I'll just give you one quick story. It's a section of the book that I don't want to, you know, be rude or anything, but what year were you born?
1984.
So you were born 8 years after, or let's say 6 years after when socialism almost triumphed in the Democratic Party. Did you know that?
No.
No.
Sort of. Actually, well, I don't know.
I know you know a lot because I'm not. But the reason I ask it is that it's so lost to history. It's been so pushed aside, and yet in 1977, 1978, there was a group called Democratic Agenda, backed by the United Auto Workers, the machinists, the steel workers, organized by Michael Harrington, the head of Democratic Socialists of America, and they were on the march. Right. In fact, national magazines were saying, maybe we've entered the moment of socialism, and it was such a powerful force that Ted Kennedy and others actually, were respectful of what was going on here. There were a number of political figures. There were people like Ron Dellums who were, identifying as democratic socialists and making major moves within the party long before Bernie Sanders. They had these midterm conventions, which you would have loved, right? For a whole bunch of reasons. Yeah, because you love the geekery of political operations. So they had these midterm conventions. And the deal was, because the party wanted to democratize, they wanted to make sure that they would have their national convention. And then 2 years later, they would have a midterm convention to kind of make sure if they elected a president or a Congress, that they could kind of, crack the whip a little bit, send a signal on what the party was about, what the politics was about. And at the midterm convention in 1978, they came so close to actually winning the big fights that, what the Democratic Party did? What? Ended midterm conventions.
Oh, well, that makes sense. Yeah.
No, think about it. No, but I mean, come on.
Yeah, that's it.
And the tragedy of it was the people at that midterm convention in 78 were scoping out a much more progressive, much more kind of build the base, build a radical message approach. And had they prevailed and had they pulled Jimmy Carter, a decent man, but not at that point a very successful president, had they pulled him to the left as they sought to do, and had they built a more movement-oriented politics, the Democratic Party would have been dramatically better positioned to fight with Ronald Reagan in 1980. And what I keep arguing throughout the book is, even if you're not on the left, there's a practical argument for building out a visionary politics that excites people.
Right.
And too frequently, the Democratic Party has pushed that politics away.
And of course, soon afterwards, they literally got rid of union members from the party, the Democratic Party membership, and replaced them with lobbyists.
I have a chapter in there. And you know what's fascinating about it? This is the amazing thing. It was reported on at the time.
Yeah.
And quite well. I mean, the fact of the matter is that if you pick up a newspaper today or watch the news today, we think we have all this political coverage. It's dramatically less than what we used to have. Yes. And that's very, very true. If you go back to the 40s and you talk about what Wallace was doing, every one of those things I told you about Wallace doing with all those events across the country, every one was written up in great detail in the New York Times. And the New York Times didn't like Wallace, but it was still there. Right. But there was detailed stories literally about how the lobbyists were coming into the Democratic Party in 1981, 1982, 1983, and about how, at a certain point they decided to form the Democratic Leadership Council and do all these things. And it wasn't a secret. It happened kind of it was like a glacier kind of moving, and it just pushed over everything. It remade the Democratic Party in the 80s into the 90s as something that could win elections. They did win elections now and again.
They lost the House. I mean, we had the House
but that was
how
94.
Many 30 years? I mean, but their ideas lost us the House, and the only time we win is when the Republicans royally F up.
Yeah, but here's the other you're right, but here's the other really interesting part about it. There was a pushback even at the time. People knew this was happening, and they didn't like it.
Yeah.
And so, how do you think Jesse Jackson happened in 84 and 88? The Rainbow Coalition was everybody that was getting pushed aside.
That's right.
And Jesse Jackson said, these people who had not always worked together said, hey, what? We are all being harmed. If you're a factory worker in the Midwest, if you're a farmer, if you're an urban kid, if you're living in LA, we're all being pushed out of this. But why don't we get together and take it back. And the message was so powerful that Jesse Jackson started winning primaries all over the country.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, without much money, without, a lot of, major high-level support, without, frankly, that much media initially, but he really took off. And so he gets to the convention, and I would still argue that the best speech ever delivered to a Democratic convention was Jesse Jackson's
Beautiful
1988 speech. It's unbelievable. It was an amazing speech. And he finished that speech, and the Democratic Party said, oh, we know what we'll do. We just heard an incredibly dynamic speaker talking about mobilizing the masses and building something amazing. Why don't we nominate for vice president the most boring man in the United States Senate, Lloyd Bentsen, from Texas, and we'll run a ticket of Michael Dukakis, who's not all that exciting, and Lloyd Bentsen, because that's sure to win. Mm-hmm. And they literally, Jesse Jackson was standing there. They did. I knew he wasn't going to be president, but if they had made him vice president, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I read a lot about this in the book, because I do play out these scenarios and try and figure out, what might have been.
Good. Yeah.
The fact of the matter is, I looked at the states. Do you realize in 1988 the Democrats lost California? They lost Vermont.
Vermont
in 1988. Yeah. So with all due respect,
it's Bernie's fault.
No, yeah, no. But the bottom line is, you look at the states they lost. Maybe Vermont. We'll see how that would play.
It was the socialist third partiers. They're like, we're not voting for you guys, and then as
no, it wasn't any of that.
I'm just kidding.
The fact of the matter is that they just didn't have the mobilization they needed. Yeah. And if Jackson had been on the ticket in '88, I will say this bluntly: there's no guarantee that they would have won. Times are difficult, all these challenges and stuff like that. But I will guarantee, I'll bet you whatever you want, that they would have done a whole lot better. Yeah. And that doing better would have then, positioned the party in all sorts of ways for what came next. And again and again and again, this happens, Nomiki. This marginalizing of the people who actually could make the Democratic Party into a visionary, principled party that people would stick with no matter what.
Right.
You wouldn't be talking about swing voters.
So this is interesting. I completely agree with you regarding swing voters. I mean, we don't even know what the swing voters are. There are so many people who've been blamed for 2016. But at the end of the day, I mean, you look at the numbers. It's working people were not motivated to show up because you didn't have a party that was speaking to them.
It was underperformance rather than people swinging. And I'm always troubled by the pundits who say, there are all these people who voted for Obama twice and then voted for Trump. When you look at the data, there weren't very many of those. That's very uncommon. There were people who voted for Obama twice and then didn't vote in 2016. That's a much bigger reality when you look at the data.
Right. That's and I think the way that they're assessing Biden's race is almost as if he's a substitute for Obama. Of course, he might do better in the Rust Belt, maybe, but you're fighting possible. Somebody who's, you're fighting Trump, who's not overwhelmingly popular, but might be with those voters. I don't know. I mean, the map could be a very different map. Who knows what it's going to look like? And obviously there's generational dynamics too. With that being said, every cycle, it seems, there's a third party conversation. And I'm curious, after the campaign that Bernie ran and the Democrats really flexing their muscles, although I think that they could have flexed a lot harder had Bernie actually fought harder. And I say that tactically. I don't even mean just message wise. I think that there was some poor decisions made. I think that there were a lot of people involved in 2016 that were nowhere near steering the ship in 2020. And it was reflective in, how he organized. If he organized in places, there were states that didn't have offices. I'll just throw that out there. I mean, I don't want to go into a full blown analysis of his campaign, but I think that on one hand, we're thinking, oh my God, the party is stronger than it's ever been. And they kicked us in the gut again. But on the other hand, I'm really curious if the movement was strong enough in the first place to win this election, and if it's strong enough to turn into something in another form after. Now, I mean, and what would that be? And I think a lot of people are talking about a third party, as they do every cycle. But what would that look like? And is it as strong enough to kind of take us into this new era? That makes sense.
Well, it makes sense. And you're putting all of the kind of heart and soul issues on the table, right? Mm-hmm. Because there's always this question. And here I go into a place where I have I struggle with myself on this. And I believe in multi-party democracy. I think it's healthy. I think that I've covered elections in 25 countries around the world. And wow. Intensively, and spent a lot of time on the ground in South Africa and Germany and Britain and Canada, all sorts of different places, and seen politics, Israel, Palestine. And so the end result is that multi-party democracy, interestingly enough, often dials down the personality politics and dials down a lot of the sort of the puffery of politics and gets it more toward issues. Because you can vote for a political party and knowing that it's not going to come out first, but you can get a dedicated block of backers of a Green New Deal elected, say in Germany. Right. And then if they go into coalition with a bigger party, they can force the country in the right direction. This happens all the time all over the world. I have a friend who's the prime minister of Iceland right now, oh, wow. Or an acquaintance, I'll say, and she's the prime minister of Iceland, and she leads a bizarre coalition of the far left and the center, including a lot of guys who just want to build roads, and she says, yeah, we'll build roads. And there you go. You got a coalition, right?
And the pirates, of course.
Yeah, well, the pirates were a little marginalized, actually, at one point. But the only reason I bring this up is to say that I actually think multi-party democracy is a very healthy thing. Unfortunately, in the United States, our political structures and our media structures are literally designed to militate against that. In fact, they're designed so radically to militate against it that even when it's a super good idea, it gets tripped up. And the fascinating thing was that, of course, this brings us right back to the subject of the book. Henry Wallace, who was the vice president of the United States in 1944, marginalized, pushed to the edges, pushed out of the Democratic Party, came back in 1948 and tried to run as a third-party candidate. And it looked early on like it could be an incredibly muscular third party. Like the potential was very, very great. He had a lot of support with unions. He had tremendous appeal in the African American community. There were real possibilities there. And yet, as the campaign went on, he made terrible mistakes. He got very close to the Communist Party. He was not a communist. In fact, he was a brilliant businessman, to be honest. But he had this belief that you didn't push people out. He hated the idea of the Red Scare. He hated the idea of, telling somebody you couldn't be a part of things, even if he disagreed with you on some issues. In some senses, I would go so far as to say that he tried to create a multi-party democracy within his progressive movement. Yeah. And, you talk about it in very positive ways, but boy, as you got near that election, I read through, and again, I'm as much of a geek as you are. So I read through all the media coverage going on, and you just saw the turn from September. The marginalization, the assault on Wallace. They ridiculed him for everything he had ever done. He was a very religious guy, a very Christian guy, but he was very interested in spirituality. He had read about other religions. He talked about them. He corresponded with people, and they made that into a big deal. Like he was searching for gurus. They literally did that. They ridiculed him for being athletic. No, I'm not kidding. He was an incredibly fit, athletic guy. He played tennis. He worked out. They ridiculed him for it because you're supposed to be some, like overweight cigar smoking guy in a smoke-filled room. And so by the end of the campaign, it didn't work. It did not work. And it was a very sad end by any measure. And this is not me saying that people shouldn't try third parties. I'm not, you know what I mean? I respect efforts to do, to expand our politics, but it is a cautionary tale because again and again and again throughout history, what seems to be the case, in my view, is that the most powerful forces in the Democratic Party rather like it if their problem leaves.
Exactly.
If the pressure departs,
That's
they're sort of like, thanks for, don't let us delay you in your departure. Because I think they know that in a first past the post two-party model system, it's very easy at the end of any race to sort of marginalize the third party candidate. And so I do write in the book quite a bit about this. And one of the things that I take my lessons from is the Republicans, the conservatives. They lost really bad in 1964 with Barry Goldwater. It was a crash and burn. They were losing North Dakota.
Right.
And their reaction was, let's dust ourselves off, get working, and figure out how we are going to get the Republican Party. And 2 years later, they nominated the only really good communicator associated with Goldwater for governor of California, Ronald Reagan.
Yep.
And he won. And still after that, it took him 14 years to get Reagan to the White House. But that period from 1964 to 1980 was the period in which the Republican Party was transformed by a dedicated movement. I happen to disagree with them on almost every issue, but by a dedicated movement that just kept coming back at it and building and building and building, and they prevailed. And so there are two models. One model is to say, build a third party. And if you do, I'm going to write about you, and I'm going to pay attention to what you do and respect people who make efforts to expand our politics. And there were conservatives, by the way, in the 60s and 70s who did go that way. But I would also suggest that that determination to fight for the soul of the Democratic Party, because we're stuck at this point with what sure looks like a two-party system. I'm sure going to have a lot of respect for people that try that as well.
So I have a couple of theories I want to throw by you, just because while I have you on the line. All right, so I'm probably with you when it comes to third parties. I've tried to explain to people how difficult it is to start a party. 50 states, you have to deal with Republican legislatures. There's all these different, you're not going to bring all of the Bernie-crats with you. You might bring a third. Can
I interrupt you for 1 sec and go right? Again, not to interrupt, and I do apologize. Except that there's one other element too, that everything you're describing, remember, it all takes time.
Exactly.
So if you're forming a third party, you're dealing with petitions, and imagine petitioning to get on the ballot in the coronavirus crisis.
Right.
And so you're dealing with all that, and you're dealing with all the barriers. And one of the ways that power marginalizes third parties is simply by making it take so much time that you never get to advocate for your ideas.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry,
no, this is true. Whether it's third parties or reforms, which brings me to my second point. So you have this system where the process of even just getting on the ballot is still determined by those in power. Not to mention the fact that you may not be taking all of the Bernie movement with you. You may be taking a third. People forget that Democrats do support Bernie, and union members who have to negotiate with Democratic governors may not be going third party, or maybe they would, who knows? And then there's been a lot of efforts, electorally to put pressure on Democratic, there's a lot there. With that being said, it would be interesting to see. I was thinking about this today, like how would it possibly work? Like how does a general strike work right now? How does a general strike on the Democratic Party work right now? And I think if there was a large enough faction possibly to say, we are either going to create this third party and spend all of our money and all of our time, a couple of patriotic billionaires out there who I'm sure would give some money to it, buying attack ads and targeting people like Joe Manchin. Okay, you don't want us to disrupt the presidency? That's fine. But you know what we are going to do? We're going to disrupt Joe Manchins and the Amy Klobuchars. And we're going to go through systematically and think, who are the Democrats right now that we know are bad actors? Not just primary them, just expose them. Just spend, not even in an election cycle, just spend all of the money exposing these guys. Oh, who are the DNC members who have been appointed that are lobbyists for weapons manufacturers? And they're the ones writing the rules of the Democratic Party. Oh, well, here they are. And now we have an ad on Facebook about them. So I think it's like we have to play to their they're like pressure points. And it's not, I don't see it necessarily as a party, as like some sort of giant super PAC where people are like, I don't know. I was
like super PACs, you know?
Yeah, I mean, and the Democratic Party is a super PAC. Yeah, it's the money's flowing to.
Yeah.
But I mean, I say this from like, the threat of a third party doesn't scare them, because I truly am of the belief that a lot of people who are making the decisions in the DNC and now the presidential race, at the end of the day, they're going to be fine, win or lose. Mm-hmm. And as long as they hold the power, politics is multidimensional, and maybe they think that Joe Biden is their McCain this cycle, and they'll do what they do, and they see the writing on the wall. Maybe not. But a threat of a third party doesn't scare them. Like you said, thanks, good riddance, have a nice day. We don't have to deal with you anymore. The other aspect, just one more point, sorry. The other aspect that I would love to get your perspective on is connected to this. If Bernie had any leverage right now left, I think it would be to say, okay, we want to do this convention, we want the delegates, blah, blah, blah. But I think that Joe Biden needs to call, as Barack Obama did, for the end of lobbyists within the party, the end of conflicts of interest in the party, because it's not good for anybody to have this. I think that would rid a lot of the backroom dealing. So just some ideas.
And it's fascinating because the only reason, there are a couple of times where I was like, jump in because you're putting such interesting ideas on the table. And there's so many of them, right? We have to, we have to go in a lot of different directions. But let me suggest two things here that are perhaps of interest. And one is that I think that fight for the soul of the party has not been waged, not fully been waged. It's often fought. There are battles, there are skirmishes. And in writing about a 75-year history of the party, I can identify them time and time again. What's haunting is the number of times that people who are that there have been AOCs before. Mm-hmm. Maybe not as brilliant communicators as she is, but there have been Bernie Sanderses before. There have been all of almost everything that you see. There've been people along the way, more than you would think, who fought the fight, but got beat or got drawn into the process, or in some way it didn't prevail. And what I sense is that on the part of those who really get the big benefit out of the Democratic Party, the lobbyists, the insiders, the powerful folks, they're consistent across the 75 years. They literally hand the baton off to each other if they're getting really old, but even then they stick around. And so the fact of the matter is, I think they know full well that they are in a permanent battle, right? And I'm not sure that progressives, and I say the left because I like the term, knows that it's in a permanent battle.
Yeah.
And as a result, kind of organizes and comes together at one point and then says, oh, well, we got a little progress here, or we see somebody new who's really exciting or whatever. And so that's one thing I would emphasize. And the other thing I would emphasize is that even when progressives have won the party has more than once undermined them. Yeah. Or at least not the whole of the party, but portions of it. And I have a big section of the book on George McGovern. And, George McGovern was nominated in 1972 for President of the United States. And, people like to say that the Sanders platform from 2016 was the most progressive platform in the party's history. No. The party had for the moment, at least, platforms several times that were at least as progressive as the 2016 platform. And McGovern certainly did that. If you read that platform from 72, it was amazing. And who they were trying to bring into the party, how they were trying to really build a coalition. And the interesting thing was, McGovern made a lot of mistakes. I interviewed him. I knew him in his later years. He acknowledged his mistakes. They were clear. There's no doubt of that. And maybe he had made so many mistakes that he wouldn't have been president. That's possible. But I will tell you this. Most of the criticisms of George McGovern, the attacks on George McGovern that Nixon launched in the fall, were initially launched by Hubert Humphrey and Scoop Jackson in the primaries. They identified him in ways in the primaries that the Republicans just picked up. And then here's the interesting thing. Once he was nominated, there was a massive group called Democrats for Nixon. It literally included members of Congress, senators, mayors. They spent millions of dollars. They had full-page ads in newspapers across the country, Democrats for Nixon. And it was heavily funded, very successful. And so, now everybody says, oh, McGovern, he was the most failed candidate. He got beaten horribly. We never want to do McGovern again. Well, with all due respect, if the Democratic Party had actually tried to elect the guy, even the AFL-CIO didn't back McGovern in 1972. They didn't back him. And so he was so pushed, he was so marginalized. He still got 40% of the vote on an incredibly progressive platform. So what I would tell you is that when things like that happen, what you have to realize is that if you're in a fight for the soul of the Democratic Party, you actually have to fight for it. Yeah. And you have to recognize that the people on the other side are fighting too. And so what you want to do is, then we get to this last idea that you've brought up of, a real struggle, and taking on folks, in that food chain of the party, challenging at the DNC level, challenging in primaries, and frankly, just with information, like you suggest, that is a part of this. I mean, it's one part of it. It's not the whole of it. There also has to be a visionary, optimistic, and positive part of it. Something that people want to join and want to be a part of. And so as I was thinking about doing this interview with you, because I'm doing a number of interviews on the book, but I was looking forward to talking to you. And because I know you play this interesting role. You report, but you're also in the thick of it. And so I went back and I read something that Ron Dellums, who is my hero, and Ron Dellums was congressman it was 50 years ago this spring that Ron Dellums took on a 6-term Democratic incumbent who was a liberal in a primary in Berkeley and Oakland, and beat that liberal in the primary because he said, you don't need liberals now, you need radicals. There's the Vietnam War, playing out of the civil rights movement, poverty still a real issue. And Ron Dellums went to Congress, served for decades, never lost his principles, served as a champion of democratic socialist ideals, of progressive ideals, of racial and economic justice. And then he went back to California, and late in life, he was elected mayor of Oakland and served a time there. In 2016, right after the election, he wrote an essay on how we should deal with Trump. And the interesting thing was most of the essay was about, I shouldn't say most of it, a substantial portion was about the Democratic Party. And he was very, very blunt about saying that, we have to fight Trump, but we also have to fight to make a Democratic Party that is strong enough to fight Trump.
That's right.
That is bold enough and visionary enough and forward-looking enough, not merely to beat this guy, but to make sure that it never happens again, to move our politics sufficiently to the left so that the Republicans have to move toward the center. And this is the quote-unquote genius of the Republican side. They move so far to the right that the Democrats always move to the center. What if the Democrats were pulling things in the other direction? And so I commend Dellums' essay. And a lot of these stories, this history is valuable, not because we just want to be told a good story. It's valuable because it's important to understand that these fights are not about political parties. They're about a set of values and ideals, and they're about whether we have options on the table at critical points in our history. And if one party is pulling its punches, if it's standing down, if it's just trying to win the election of the moment, but not necessarily looking at the long term to build something out, you end up in a situation where the dynamic energy too often in our politics is on the other side. And we're arguing about the issues of the other side. I can tell you this without a question, that if the Democratic Party had made an absolute commitment to single-payer Medicare for all in the 1990s, we'd have it today. Yeah. It might have been some lost elections along the way, but the movement would have built, the moment would have come. And if the Democratic Party had moved more to the left in the 90s, the 2000s, even the 2010s. When we got to this current moment that we are in, think about, because we're in a crisis moment and it's overwhelming and we're struggling to find answers. Well, the fact is there's a lot of answers,
Right.
But it's hard to push them to the center of our politics when you haven't been talking about them for a long time.
Right.
So.
And when the party has abandoned so much of the country, we said this on the Unity Reform Commission over and over. It's one thing to have the right message at a moment, but if you don't have messengers across the country every single election cycle repeating that message, that's how Donald Trump can swoop in and basically take advantage of that.
Oh, and it frustrates me so much. It's funny, I have a piece that I wrote just for today about the ruralorganizing.com. It's a group that's trying to organize progressives in rural America and arguing that the fact is you shouldn't give up on rural America. If you mobilize people in the right way, there's a mass of progressive votes out there. And, they're trying to save the Postal Service. They got 300,000 people to sign petitions. They got 25,000 people to agree, mostly rural, to agree to write handwritten letters and put a stamp on it, to save the Postal Service. And they got this incredible guy, Joe Troop, to write a song for him. And it's straight out of Woody Guthrie. It's beautiful and amazing. And it's speaking right to rural America and speaking right to small town folks. And it just seems to me, I don't want to be overly romantic about this, but the fact of the matter is the greatest thing that Henry Wallace did was in his failed 1948 campaign, he refused to speak to segregated audiences. And he took a tour of the South. He went deep into the South. There are pictures of him. He had to eat his lunches in his car because the restaurants were segregated. They slept in the homes of friends. He was down there with, union folks, Paul Robeson, people like that. And his running mate, Glenn Taylor, senator from Idaho, was literally arrested for refusing to go in through a whites-only door to a meeting. They pushed the limit. That's
yes.
They went deep into the South. And the fact of the matter is that in doing the book, I talked to people who were very old, people who were, people now in their 90s, who remembered that. They remembered that somebody came and tried. And the fact of the matter is that the Democratic Party, if it's to be the party that it should be, it ought to be the party that comes and tries, even if it's very difficult for immigrants and for people without documentation and for LGBTQ kids in small towns and rural areas and for trade unionists who are organizing now in some of the most difficult circumstances imaginable, and for women still struggling with insufficient pay and insufficient respect, and for, frankly, the working class and the precariat, those folks who really now are even struggling to be in the working class. I believe strongly that when Franklin Roosevelt outlined an economic Bill of Rights, he assured that he would be reelected to a fourth term. And I am absolutely convinced that if a Democratic Party genuinely outlined an economic Bill of Rights, and frankly, a new civil rights agenda, a new civil liberties agenda, I do not believe this would marginalize. I don't, even as bad as our media is, even as bad as our politics is, I think this is the breakthrough moment. And, the funny thing about it is I went with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and working on the book, we were in Detroit, where Wallace had gone in 43 to do the great speech challenging racism. And we talked a little bit about it one night, and we were late at night. It was midnight in Dearborn, Michigan. And she said the best thing. It's the closing line of the book. We were talking about, these folks who went when nobody else would go, and who challenged the orthodoxies, and who challenged imperialism and colonialism and racism and sexism in the 40s. And she said, not that she wanted to recreate everything. She had this wonderful line. She says, I want to be that party again. I want to be the party that tries that hard. And the fact of the matter is that's part of why I wrote the book.
I can't wait to read it. it is out now. I have it on, but we've been talking about this, and as an issue I clearly care about a lot. And I think it's the theme of this show is just what your book is about. It's why we exist. It's, a lot of people host shows for a lot of reasons. I didn't want to focus on the scandal of the day. I really wanted to focus on what it takes to win this lifetime fight. And it's a constant fight. It's a hard fight. I think we all would prefer to be in a different circumstance right now, even electorally, but we must garner on. We can't give up. It has been worse, if we can believe it. And that's why it's important to read history. So John, I appreciate you for doing this work, for reporting, for trying.
Yeah.
Because the other end of this, which you illustrated in that first book that I read, how I Met You, about journalism, is it's just not the same anymore. And there isn't a lot of trying for a whole lot of reasons. And there aren't a lot of reporters out there who can, even if they could, it's just, we don't have state house reporters. We don't have local reporters at the level that we used to. So thank you. Thank you for doing this. I'm
not going to give up. When Roosevelt or when Henry Wallace was on the campaign trail, he campaigned with Pete Seeger at his side.
Oh my God.
And Pete Seeger always sang it late at night when they'd had, a rough rally in the South or someplace. He would always ask Pete Seeger to sing a song to him. And the song was Passing Through. It was a relatively recently written folk song.
So cool.
And the close of the song was, I was at Franklin Roosevelt's side on the night before he died. He said, one world must come out of World War II. Yankee, Russian, black or tan, a man is still a man. We're all on one road and we're only passing through. And
chills.
They would sit, and Wallace and Seeger would sit and sing that song in the back of a car or the back of a bus. And the only reason I bring it up is that core vision, the only thing I'd change in the lyrics would say one man and maybe one woman. But at some fundamental level, that core vision that we're fighting for humanity. Mm-hmm. And so I'm honored to have joined you and to talk about that.
Thank you to Samelys López and to John Nichols. And if you're not already subscribing, please click subscribe on YouTube and share. And, if you click the alert button, you'll know without even having to put it into your calendar when we go live. Because every Tuesday and Thursday, starting at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern, we are doing lives on YouTube where I'm going to be giving you hot takes when news breaks, and I'll be answering your questions in Superchat. Make sure to check us out on YouTube. Have a safe and healthy week, and we will see you next week on Monday on YouTube and early for patrons.